I'm Nathan Gita.
And I'm Aaron Ekman.
From BC's northern capital.
Welcome to the Ram and Stag Show.
Does our Constitution mean anything anymore? From our earliest civics classes in school, or from the time we begin our path to citizenship, we are taught that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is a sacred document, ensuring justice and equality for all, regardless of race, class, creed, or background. The Constitution sets its own high measures in its opening lines, whereas Canada was founded on principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. But since the pandemic began, these solemn declarations have not been the guiding principles of our public policy response to the virus. Instead, the section that immediately follows has been interpreted as broadly as possible by our authorities. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. Let's just look at that a little more closely. Reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. You can read that one of two ways. Most of us would read that to mean it is difficult to restrict civil liberties and fundamental rights in Canada. But as the virus has demonstrated, our authorities believe that Section 1 permits them to suspend any activities that they deem to be unsafe. Here in British Columbia, one of those high-risk activities has been gathering for public worship, or, in layman's terms, going to church is extremely dangerous. Mosques, temples, synagogues, parishes, and gurwars were shuttered last year during the initial shutdown and are now at over 100 days of being closed since the second lockdown began. This has resulted in many holy days of all religions going unobserved by the faithful, who are becoming increasingly frustrated. What makes this situation even worse is that while houses of the holy are closed, all of the houses of sin, vice, or worldly needs are open. You can't go into an establishment that was built for prayer, but you can go into one that was built for booze, gambling, or marijuana. The places of worship and the churches are closed, but Walmart and Costco are open, continuing to serve thousands of people daily, while the largest shrine doesn't even get a tenth of that, just once a week. Dr. Bonnie Henry has been adamant. Faith is not a building, she said. It's not about Sunday mornings, but it's about every day and how we connect with each other and how we support each other. It's not about rights. Many of us might cite the Charter to prove her wrong, as our first fundamental freedom is of conscience and religion, then expression, then assembly, then association. But Section 1 precedes our fundamental freedoms and can be used to limit them. Churches in the Lower Mainland are finally demanding clarification regarding these orders, and thus they are before the BC Supreme Court alongside the government. Unfortunately for our dear leaders, Chief Justice Christopher Hinkson is not interested in twisting the law into pretzels to accommodate the government's closures of churches. Indeed, Dr. Henry herself filed no affidavit for the case, so Judge Hinkson asked the obvious. How do I know what she is thinking and why? He went on, when you deprive the complainants of the ability to understand how she got from A to B, the court can't look at it, and it really isn't much of a review. It gives Dr. Henry absolute authority, and if she chooses not to share her thought process with the court, there is no oversight. Absolute authority, no oversight, nothing to review. It's a miracle to hear these words from Judge Hinkson. We, the faithful, have been called obscenities and slurs for a year for saying the same. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms cannot be ignored, even in the midst of a pandemic. Thanks to a few brave souls down in the Lower Mainland, Dr. Henry's orders are finally being weighed and measured after a year. Let's all pray that they are found wanting so we can finally get our civil liberties back.
And whatever your position on this, and of course, I'm not a churchgoer. I probably should be. It'd probably be a much better way to spend my Sundays than the copious amounts of video games that I play by myself in my house.
I'm not a priest, right? Like confessing to me, confessing to me isn't going to do this for you. Like,
the contradiction is undeniable. It's a good point you raise. That, I mean, I was actually down at Walmart yesterday looking for a old component video switch box that you can't find anymore because I'm trying to get my old Xbox running again. There's a lot of people there. I had a hard time getting a parking spot. And, even as somebody who doesn't go to church, not a religious person, I have always found it to be a bit of a contradiction that these places have been shut down. And I understand. I mean, you want to stop the transmission of the virus, but I was also in a restaurant yesterday, and I went to my favorite local pub. I'm not going to tell anybody what it is because I like being able to get a seat there.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a few fewer seats available there now because they've had to space things out, but not many. It's not like there's half the seats. They've just put the allowable, the required amount of space between each seat, and people go in there, and the place was almost packed. It was below the 56-person maximum that's posted on the door or whatever. But I just thought to myself, surely they can figure this out in churches if they're given the same restrictions.
Well, you see, the trick is that, well, it's not even a trick. It's like it's this truth. It's this hidden truth about the virus. It's a deeply religious virus. Right. Like it can only be found at church. Like it can't be found at Costco.
Just hunkered down there.
It can't be found at any big box store. It can only be found at churches and occasionally small businesses, but not the big box stores.
But does it attack the people who are like the real converted, or does it just go after the people who are the real sinners that haven't confessed? And
you see, this is the question.
Right.
This is a question. Trial. We used to call that a trial by what was that? Trial by persecution or something like that. I think the thing is that where this really touches me is that, I mean, obviously I take my faith very seriously. Like that's all very serious stuff, all joking aside. But the other side of the question for me is that, like, this is vital to people's just cultural understanding, how they celebrate things, how they mark things in their life. I mean, right now, there's fasts going on in certain faiths, and then there are feasts coming in other faiths. Like, this is very important. And the fact that that's just been cut off for basically a year in some places, depending on where you're from throughout the world. But here in BC, we've had 2 significant full stops on worship. It really perturbs us who are religiously observant, who are faithful, and don't see the consistency. And I could understand everyone staying at home and being paid to stay at home for 3 months or whatever we got to do to solve the virus problem. Like, okay, I could reason my way through that, but it just doesn't make sense that churches are closed and the stores and all the other places in the malls are open. That doesn't make sense.
I have to admit, I winced when I heard Dr. Bonnie Henry's rationale for this, trying to tell people that faith is not a building and it's it's not something that only takes place on Sunday. I just thought, I get it. I mean, you're a medical professional. I trust you in terms of the measures that you're taking, et cetera. But it probably isn't helpful to explain to a faith-based community what faith means.
Yeah.
I guess I get what you were trying to accomplish there. But when I heard that, I thought, oh, that's not going to go over well.
No, and it didn't. It really didn't, obviously, and that's just it. Like, we don't turn to our medical professionals to catechize us about our various religions. We turn to them to help us with the body politic when it comes to health. Church, there's so much precedence in the past around questions of plague and pandemic. It's not as if religions don't know what plague is, right? It's very few people in any religious group, even through the ones that might, some of our listeners and watchers might think are kind of very extreme or whatever. The fact of the matter is that not even in that minority, there's a minority in that minority that would even imagine that somehow, the effects of the world don't affect them both in their worldly life and their spiritual life. They understand that. And going all the way back through in the Western world, particularly the Catholic Church, having been around the longest, has several moments where they had to deal with pandemic and plague and how that changed their worship services and their liturgy. The same thing can be found in the subcontinent. The same thing can be found in China. I'm sure that we could find it even in Pacific religions and religions that were in the New World. We would find that when there was pandemic, plague, disease, epidemic, they needed to figure things out and perhaps curtail things in order to survive as a people group. That's not the question. The question is, there has to be consistency across the board, and it doesn't matter where we are. We're in a post-Enlightenment age, and if we believe in fairness and that everybody has to be treated the same, you cannot treat businesses different than churches. That just doesn't make sense.
I think if I was to try to sort of steelman the best argument for those that are in favor of shutting churches down and continuing that closure, They're drawing the example, I guess, from the original, what was it, 1912 Spanish flu? Was it 1912?
It's 1917, 18, 19.
Yeah. So and if you read through the records, and there were adamant arguments being made in opposition of the lockdowns, the limited lockdowns that they implemented then, predominantly from churches, because they did shut down churches at that time too. So I imagine they're trying to look at that example and say, in those cases where you had these massive congregations of people, they probably contributed to these super spreader events, that kind of thing. So there's that argument there. I get that. But the contradiction is in all, as you've pointed out so well, all of the other areas that they're not shutting down. But I'll put this question to you. I haven't heard you say this, but I haven't got anybody else from the right here sitting at the table with me. So if I was to agree with you that, yes, we probably should treat churches at least the same as Walmart and Costco and, every restaurant I've been to in the last couple of months. But can you argue realistically that churches should be opened up now, but at the same time argue that the BCNDP was wrong to have put together an election when really the numbers haven't changed that much in terms of transmission, new cases? They've gone down a little bit, but we hadn't quite hit the spike of the second wave by the 2020 election yet. And we heard all of these arguments from the opposition at the time that, and the Green Party, that the election can't take place now because it's going to contribute to the spread. And certainly I've heard commentators on the right also say, try to attribute the spike of the second wave to that election. So how can you make that, and I'm not saying you are, but how would one make that argument that churches should be open now when we're still averaging about, 400 or 500 cases a day, 300 to 400 or 500 cases a day. And so there's still this risk of transmission, risk of new variants coming in, but still blame the BCNDP for the spike in transmission because of the election.
Well, I think the real risk was always, of course, the spread of socialism. So we had to make we couldn't let there be an election.
Right.
That was really dangerous.
Right. It was the other pandemic.
That's right.
The other
that's right.
viral
I mean,
danger.
So we had this kind of perforated wall when it came to the virus, and we didn't want people to go in there and start voting, casting their ballots for $5 a day daycare, whatever else kind of socialist crazy crap is coming.
On that point, clearly you were correct, because we now have a socialist government.
There it is.
With an expanded mandate.
I think the thing is that it was purely a talking point. There were some people who were probably genuinely afraid, but I'm sorry, I'm going to have to throw my own side on the bus here. Like, I never argued that myself. I didn't expect the American election to be suspended, and I didn't like the result, did I? But I accepted that they were going to have their election. They weren't going to change it. They'd had it through wars. They'd had it through a civil war. And so I never understood the argument there. So I think I would have been pretty consistent saying the churches should be open, so should the ballot boxes. Like, I don't understand how anybody could make this argument that, again, Costco's open, but somehow BC elections is closed. That doesn't make any sense.
I was encouraged to see this decision by the judge to strike down the injunction, essentially not honor it. Which sort of opens the door, I guess. I don't know what it's going to look like now. You'll know better than I do, but I mean, as it stands now, congregations that you've attended have been out in the parking lot anyway, and
that's right. That's right. I think one of the things that's really important there, and this is something that, I don't know, right? Like the BC Civil Liberties Union and everybody else that's pro-civil liberties, regardless of their background, should all be on the same side, is that injunctions are a really, really nasty little trick that people play with, because they just prevent the thing from happening, but they don't charge you with a crime. But then if you do the thing, you are found in contempt of a court injunction. So they didn't come and arrest you because you committed a crime or something specific. There's an ordinance somewhere that you trespassed against. They get you on contempt, right? Or having trespassed this injunction, and you're stuck. Like, and what's your lawyer going to argue? You have the best lawyer in Canada. What are they going to argue? Like, I mean, literally the injunction says this, and you literally did that. Yeah. So you're done. And it's ridiculous. So then you get put in prison for a bit, because anything against a court, right, in order to ensure that our justice system is always respected, anything against a court is going to result in that. So I think for myself, I'm just excited that we finally have somebody in a justice robe that's actually got some common sense and is just demanding some clarification around these issues, and is not just going to roll over and play nice with the government. I don't think judges should ever play nice with the government. I think they should assert that civil liberties come first.
Well, there has to be a tension there between the two bodies. But I am also encouraged that the ruling went this way, because there is this fundamental question underlying all this, which is whose authority is greater, that of the Constitution, certainly the judiciary who interprets it when the questions are brought into place, or these unelected public health officials. And, the public health official it's an interesting position within society. And it's not one that we've really had to grapple with very much because we haven't had a pandemic like this since 1917, where they've come in and just sort of burst onto the stage. Now the electorate now sees them every day in these briefings, and they have enormous power over everybody's everyday life. The power to shut down businesses, power to keep you in your home. It's a militaristic type power that people didn't really realize that these public health officers had. And so it's interesting. Like, what's the limits of those powers? And of course, they've debating this vociferously in the U.S. for quite some time, especially in New York, and that's playing out in interesting ways. But it has, I said quite some time ago, before we sort of got into the spike of the first wave, when everybody was glowing over Dr. Bonnie Henry and the flu vogs had come out, and she could just, she was suddenly this national, if not international, sensation to some degree, of like the example of how you do it correctly. And not to take anything away from her, but I remember saying to my partner at the time when I was watching all these news stories, going, well, this is not going to age well. Like, at some point, people are going to start to feel the crush of the authority of this position. Doesn't matter who's in it. Yeah. And you can see some of that starting to play out at the federal level. Of course, Theresa Tam has had a lot of shade thrown her way from various corners. Bonnie Henry has been quite resilient. I mean, like the cult of personality around her has survived much longer than I thought it would. But as we start to get to the tail end of the second wave, and perhaps if there is going to be a third wave or additional variants, it's interesting to see how the tide starts to shift a little bit as people start to run out of options. And faith and worship and the observance of faith is one area. Of course, the economics of the ramifications of the economics of all this is another. When restaurants, you start to see them dropping. You start to see businesses going out. You can start to see people that that have lost their job. They can't work anymore. And you start to see the effect that has on society. Well, people aren't going to be making more shoes in her name at some point. And so it's sort of...
She's got to get her book deal now.
Cash in now, because it's a time, your time in the zeitgeist is probably limited.
And it is, right? It is. Like, I think that you're right, that, maybe you kind of live long enough to see yourself become the the villain sort of thing. And the issue becomes very quickly that if you don't have your feet in motion, you could very quickly get stuck, and then you're going to get tagged, right? You're going to get tagged with the bad policy. You're the reason this went wrong. That's the other thing about the public health side of things, or even medical professionals in general. I really respect what they do. There's no question. But at the same time, like, they don't play political games very well, because they come from a basically still a fairly meritocratic background and a very hierarchical one where decisions are made in this way, and this is the specialist, this is the generalist, this is the anesthetician, this is what's happening over here. This is what's going on with the nursing area, etc. So the issue is that once they're into the public spotlight, it's a very different set of rules. And a second opinion in the public sphere is different than it is in the medical sphere. So I think that that's what's kind of wearing on her to a point, is that she's going to have to basically take a step back, acknowledge that some things went sideways, and maybe pivot or actually get out of the way and put someone else in front, because very quickly the public, I think, is going to tire of what's going on, if it hasn't already.
Yeah, or at least acknowledge that the authority was overstepped.
Yep.
Which probably would go a long way to placating some of the folks that are quite angry by the decisions that have been made.
She could come do some penance in front of all of the ministers of various religions, and they could all give her absolution in a different way, and
self-flagellation with a pool noodle.
Yeah. I mean, it all sounds so terrible, I guess. Like, we're probably going to get flagged for all these comments because it sounds like we're, I don't know, inciting violence or something. I don't know. But the issue is that, like, real people, it's the after effect. It's even like the soft side of it. Like, if people can say, like, China lied, people died. That's true. But further to that, it's like, well, we overcompensated in some areas, or we've been very inconsistent, and real people did not get their last rites. That's part of my faith. That is an absolutely critical part of my faith, going out the door. And perhaps those people were going out the door with COVID, and they didn't get last rites. And baptisms have been missed or curtailed. Weddings have been suspended or all but uncelebrated, and might as well be a funeral. It's it's been a dark time in faith. And I can't attest to how it is in all the other religions because I don't know them as well as I know my own. But I do know that religion is deeply important to all of us who are people of faith. And we are tired and we are hungry to go back to where our true home is, right, in our hearts. And we're tired of it. We want to accept the risks as they are. We want to be smart about it, and we want to move forward.
Why don't you take us out?
Alrighty. And we'll be on with a little bit more in a little while.